The night was hot and heavy, with the smell of salt and rain when the first American transport ships crept silently toward the black outline of Guadalcanal. It was August 6th, 1942, and somewhere beyond that wall of jungle lay the first step in America's long road back across the Pacific. The men of the 1st Marine Division, seasick and sleepless, leaned against the rails and stared into the darkness, their rifles clutched to their chests. None of them had ever heard of Guadalcanal before they'd been ordered to take it. Most couldn't even find it on a map, but that island, covered in thick jungle and crawling with unseen enemies, would soon become a name burned into their souls. The campaign began almost by accident. In the first months after Pearl Harbor, Japan's empire had exploded across the Pacific, devouring territory from the Philippines to New Guinea. The U.S. Navy, still reeling from its losses, could do little but hold on. But then came Midway, June 1942, when 4 Japanese carriers were sent to the bottom of the sea. For the first time, the tide had turned. And in that brief moment of advantage, American commanders saw an opportunity. The Japanese were building an airfield on Guadalcanal, one that could threaten Allied supply lines to Australia. If that airfield was completed, it could strangle the Pacific campaign before it began. The order was given: take the island. At dawn on August 7th, the sea erupted. From the decks of cruisers and destroyers, the sky filled with the thunder of naval guns. Shells screamed over the beaches, tearing through the palm trees and ripping apart the jungle. The men of the 1st Marine Division, led by Major General Alexander A. Vandegrift, clambered into landing craft. "All right, you bastards," a sergeant shouted. "This is it." The boats roared toward the shore, bouncing on the surf, engines straining. When the ramps dropped, they expected machine gun fire, screaming mortars, the chaos of Tarawa or Iwo Jima. But instead, silence. The Japanese construction crews had fled into the jungle at the first sign of bombardment. The Marines waited ashore unopposed, bewildered by the lack of resistance. They fanned out, advancing through the coconut groves and up toward the half-finished airstrip that glimmered in the sunlight. Within hours, Guadalcanal was in American hands. Or so it seemed. The Marines named the airfield Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine pilot killed at Midway. They began working immediately to fortify it, digging foxholes and setting up defenses. But supplies were scarce and the jungle was thick and alien. Mosquitoes swarmed by the thousands. The air reeked of rot and mildew. The men's clothes were perpetually damp, their boots filled with mud. In the first week, diarrhea and malaria struck harder than any Japanese bullet. The Marines were isolated, their fate tied to a thin lifeline of ships and aircraft. Then came the night of August 8th, the night the sea burned. While the Marines dug in on shore, a Japanese task force slipped through the channels of the Solomon Islands. Under the command of Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, the Japanese cruisers closed in under cover of darkness. They struck suddenly, their torpedoes tearing through the Allied naval screen like sharks through baitfish. In less than an hour, 4 Allied cruisers were sent to the bottom: Astoria, Quincy, Vincennes, and Canberra. Over 1,000 sailors were lost. It would be remembered as the Battle of Savo Island, one of the worst defeats in U.S. naval history. When dawn came, the American transports were gone, having fled in panic. The Marines on Guadalcanal were now stranded. For the next 6 months, the island became a living hell. Every night, the men could hear the distant rumble of engines from the north. The Tokyo Express, Japanese destroyers racing down from bases in Rabaul to deliver troops and supplies under the cover of darkness. Each dawn brought air raids from Rabaul, the high-pitched whine of engines, the whistling of bombs, the sudden roar of explosions. By day, the Marines worked to keep Henderson Field operational. By night, they waited for attacks that always came. On August 21st, the first major assault hit, the Battle of the Tenaru River. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers, led by Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, charged across the sandbar screaming, "Banzai!" The Marines opened up with machine guns, rifles, and canister shot. The Japanese kept coming, fearless and fanatical. When morning came, over 800 enemy bodies littered the beach. The stench of death clung to the air for days. It was a shocking lesson. Guadalcanal would not be given up easily. As the weeks dragged on, both sides poured more men into the struggle. For the Marines, supplies arrived sporadically, always under threat from Japanese air and sea power. Canned rations ran out, they ate captured rice crawling with weevils. Dysentery spread through the ranks. Yet the spirit of the men remained unbroken. "We're holding the line," one Marine wrote home. "If we don't, there won't be any line left." By September, the Japanese launched another offensive, this time a determined attempt to overrun Henderson Field. The fighting that followed would enter legend. Edson's Ridge, later known as Bloody Ridge, Colonel Merritt, Red Mike Edson, and his raiders held a narrow ridgeline south of the airfield against waves of Japanese attacks. For 2 nights, the jungle echoed with screams and gunfire. Flares lit up the darkness as Marines fought hand-to-hand with bayonets and grenades. When dawn broke, the ridge was carpeted with bodies. Edson's men had held, barely. Still, the cost was immense. The Japanese didn't give up. They kept coming down the slot, convoys of destroyers braving American planes and submarines to land more troops. The battles raged in the air as well. Cactus Air Force, the ragtag group of Marine and Navy pilots based at Henderson, fought daily duels against the Japanese Zeros. Men like Major John Smith and Joe Foss became legends in the skies, flying worn-out planes patched with tin and hope. Then came October. Torrential rains turned Henderson Field into a swamp. Trucks sank into the mud, tents collapsed under the downpour. In the midst of this misery, the Japanese launched another massive attack. Over 20,000 troops under General Maruyama attempted to encircle the American lines. The battle raged for days. The jungle was so dense that visibility was measured in feet. Machine guns overheated. Men fought with knives and entrenching tools. But once again, the Marines held. The bodies of the enemy lay tangled in the roots of the jungle, silent testimony to the ferocity of the fight. At sea, the struggle was equally desperate. In November, the Japanese made a final, all-out attempt to retake the island. The result was the naval battle of Guadalcanal, a series of chaotic, nightmarish clashes fought at point-blank range. Ships fired at shadows, searchlights revealed horrors, entire decks erupted in fire. Admiral Callahan and Admiral Scott went down with their ships, but the Japanese transports were destroyed before they could land. Henderson Field remained in American hands. By January 1943, the tide had turned completely. The Japanese, their supply lines shattered, starving and diseased, began to withdraw. The once proud Imperial Army, which had seemed invincible a year earlier, was beaten. On February 9, 1943, Guadalcanal was declared secure. The campaign had lasted 6 months and cost tens of thousands of lives, American, Japanese, and Islander alike. But from that brutal, rain-soaked island, a new chapter of the war had begun. The United States had proven it could stop Japan, and more than that, it could win. Guadalcanal became the symbol of a turning tide, the first step in a relentless march across the Pacific that would end 3 years later in Tokyo Bay. For the men who fought there, though, the memory never faded. They remembered the sound of rain on ponchos, the distant hum of engines over the slot, the faces of friends left behind in the mud. Guadalcanal was not just a battlefield, it was a crucible. Out of its fire came the hardened core of the American fighting spirit, and long after the last gun fell silent, when the jungle reclaimed the trenches and the rusting hulks sank into coral and sand, the island still whispered their names, carried on the warm wind that blows forever across the Solomon Sea.